First, before I get into my topic for this video, I'd like to address the elephant in the room and talk about how and why I disappeared for literally years on this channel. I got locked out, in short. I lost my old phone and I hadn't backed this account up like a silly goose, so I lost access to the email attached to this account. At first, I'd gone on hiatus because I had no computer and no means to edit. Then I got locked out entirely. Finally, just a month ago, I figured out how to get back in and recover the account. Thank you all for sticking with my channel for this long. I appreciate every one of you who has subscribed and commented, some of you in my absence. This fandom means the world to me. So if you will, join me to revisit this story I love so dearly, to reflect on the values, themes, depth, and intention contained within. Homestuck, a narrative fever dream. If you've read Homestuck, you probably don't think about it like the average piece of fictional media. It's not merely a book, a show, or a movie. It can't even be precisely placed in a single genre. Science fiction, fantasy, psychological thriller, cosmic horror, comedy, tragedy. It contains threads of all of this and more. It is sometimes classical, mythical even, yet deeply postmodern. A blended fusion of old and new literary themes, tropes, and archetypes. Homestuck is not at all a clean, simple narrative that moves in a concise and linear way. Homestuck changed how internet storytelling works by prioritizing character voice, emotional realism, and dialogue structure over traditional plot. There's a complicated overarching plot, but that's not really the part people get attached to, generally speaking. The unusual structure of Homestuck isn't always easy to follow for the unfamiliar reader, but if you invest your attention and interest into the story it wants to tell you, it will take you for a journey unlike anything you've experienced before. You just have to be okay with being confused at the start, because eventually it all makes sense. You will often be perplexed and flummoxed, but always entertained. Then you will be hit at random times with bombshells of profundity and revelation. Small pieces come together into a huge, ever-growing picture that feels as endless and infinitely expansive as our own universe. Because of the way Homestuck treats canon, everything you can imagine with these characters and narrative mechanics is possible and true all at once. This grants extensive creative freedom for the direction of the story, allowing it to derail itself entirely and still feel like it makes sense. Whether this be the Schrödingerian dilemma of a character being simultaneously alive and dead, the story retconning itself using convoluted mechanisms, infinite pairings and relationships amongst any and all characters, and so much more. This is all canonically accepted by the author as real alternate timelines that exist ad infinitum. Thus, one doesn't usually remember Homestuck in a neat, chronological way. A clean timeline doesn't come to mind when recalling the main body of the material. There are chronological markers, but rarely does one view the events of the story as entirely in order. Instead, you remember specific conversations. You remember moments where a character said something that felt way too relatable for what started as an unhinged niche webcomic. You remember the overall tone and dialogue more than the plot. It contains this fun mix of sarcasm and implicit authenticity, where everything feels unserious until suddenly it isn't and you're dragged unceremoniously onto a figurative roller coaster. The realistic dialogue genuinely feels like reading the chat logs of a bunch of edgy, arrogant, naive teenagers. The jokes and goofs constantly interrupt otherwise solemn or dire situations. It all meshes together to weave a mesmerizing pattern of character development and narrative conviction. The emotional whiplash within the narrative is intense, yet never too much. It remains enjoyable and comprehensible. Despite abrupt shifts in tone, the depth and appeal of the story itself remains. The sudden tone switches don't feel cheap or unearned, but like real-world conversations and events that would unfold in a manner that isn't always predictable or logical. There's a profound depth to the narrative, and it hides behind a veneer of gags and misdirections. The strangest part is how personal it all feels, even years later when familiarity dulls and memory fails to retain the entirety of Homestuck's events. It stays there, in the back of your mind. The beloved characters, the hilarious dialogue, and occasional profound quotations. For many of us growing up, this narrative was a formative developmental experience that helped to heal our very real traumas and tribulations. Like Eridan said, it's hard being a kid and growing up. It's hard, and nobody understands. This is a core statement to the purpose of Homestuck's themes, a paragon among all other coming-of-age epics. I began reading Homestuck at 12 years old. I am now 27. 15 years later, I'm still just as attached to this story as ever, and I have more clarity of the narrative themes in retrospect. Homestuck and the impact of meta-narrative. Homestuck feels like a time capsule of early internet culture. The pacing feels chaotic, but still emotionally consistent. The characters feel more real than most fictional teenagers, and the emotional core of the story was never just romance, but more so friendship. Due to the narrative depth of Homestuck, the fandom is fervently, zealously attached to the characters in a way that's honestly pretty rare even now. I don't think Homestuck was just a story that happened to exist on the internet. I think it was a story that only works because of the internet. The pacing feels like how people actually talked online. The humor feels like irony culture before irony became completely self-aware. The characters feel like actual teenagers who learned how to express emotions through sarcasm instead of sincerity. And the structure feels chaotic in a way that makes sense if you remember what early internet culture actually felt like. Unpredictable, messy, and constantly shifting tone without warning. The dialogue structure feels like chat rooms. The pacing hits like long-form conversations that went on way longer than they needed to. The humor embodies early meme culture before memes were polished and self-aware. It feels messy, weird, and unpolished in the exact way the internet used to feel charmingly janky in the Y2K and 2010s eras. Early 2010s internet culture also had this very specific emotional atmosphere where people cared deeply about things, but were absolutely terrified of sounding sincere about it. So instead of saying what they actually felt, people hid everything behind sarcasm, irony, and jokes that went on just a little too long. And that's exactly how the characters in Homestuck talk to each other. Once you notice it, nearly all of the dialogue indicates the characters are individually masking around each other in one way or another. They care deeply about each other, but they almost never say it directly. They hide sincerity behind humor because sincerity feels embarrassing or even threatening. They talk for pages and pages about nothing because saying something important directly would feel too vulnerable. The story doesn't feel outdated now, even though one might have expected it to age badly, because it didn't just copy and paste internet culture in a vapid, performative display of comedic slop. Despite the dated stylization and themes, the narrative remains timeless. Homestuck captured something emotional and visceral about that internet era that is actually very hard to recreate now. It's nostalgic for the late aughts and early 10s internet culture, but in a way that feels authentic and not forced. Trying to explain Homestuck to someone who hasn't read it feels like trying to explain a dream that only made sense while you were inside it. You start with, it's a dense, dialogue-heavy, epic saga of a webcomic that includes additional material like flash animations and flash games, and already you can feel the conversation slipping away. Then you try to clarify. The entire thing technically began as a joke. There are multiple timelines, and there are 4 main characters at first, with multiple versions of each of them. Then all of a sudden these aliens are introduced, and then there's more characters than you can keep up with. And the whole time you know that you sound ridiculous trying to help the uninitiated fathom the insane word salad info dump you're slamming them with. Trying to explain even the most rudimentary and abridged take on what Homestuck is can easily spiral into a floundering mess, especially because you don't want to spoil all the most compelling parts of it, which are best experienced blindly. Giving context to Homestuck without ruining the entire appeal of it is sometimes an incredibly difficult task. Most stories fade a little once you're done with them. You move on, you forget parts of it, it becomes something you enjoyed once but don't really think about anymore. Homestuck doesn't really do that. Even if you forget plot points, it sticks to your mind, influencing your personality, your humor, your interests, sometimes even your identity, all in a way that's kind of hard to explain. Not because the plot is perfect, it absolutely isn't, but because the characters feel like people you spent way too much time with. People you watch develop in real time instead of all at once. The characters all feel like internet friends or buddies that you grew up with. People who read Homestuck don't talk about it like it was just a webcomic. They talk about it like it was something they lived through, like it was a social experience instead of a piece of media, because it was. By nature of its origin on the internet, it encouraged a loyal, interconnected, and emotionally invested community to form around it, sharing art, theories, memes, hot takes, cosplay, DIY tutorials, and so much more. Some fans even went on to participate in partial authorship or artistry of the property alongside Hussey. Sure, many fandoms have similar fervent camaraderie online, but Homestuck had a certain flavor no other fandom has ever replicated, in my opinion. This all sounds kinda melodramatic until you actually read it, because somehow this chaotic, nonsensical, completely absurd story ends up being one of the most emotionally sincere things to ever come from early internet culture. Buried under thick layers of irony and satirical silliness, there's a philosophical tale containing references and allusions to esoteric subjects like Gnosticism, historical and mythical events of our world, as well as clearly absurdist and nihilist adjacent ideas bounced around within the narrative. And don't even get me started on the queer theory aspects of the world building and characterization. Homestuck is a modern-day Dante's Inferno, a complex work that contains Shakespearean levels of whimsical hijinks with a dash of casual, unapologetic queer coding. In my opinion, it is a saga that speaks of friendship, perseverance, and trauma so profoundly that it rivals the work of Tolkien at times. All of this lies hidden beneath a silly, colorful disguise of goofy aesthetics, which makes it appear to be merely a huge, overcomplicated meme. Yet, despite being one of the biggest lolcow farms supplying internet edgelords with cringe fans to make fun of for years now, it contains far more substance than these people realize. They see it at face value as just one big joke. Likened to furries and other groups that the internet deems worthy of demeaning, Homestuck fans are sometimes seen as a monolith of crazed, cult-like super freaks. More so from the time period of 2010 to 2016, in my experience. Homestucks are perceived as so nerdy, obsessive, and socially inept that even other nerds often don't want to associate with us. Despite this, the Homestuck community has some of the coolest people I've ever met. I've made incredible long-term friends in this fan base. Sure, there's some stinkers, as with every fan base, yet the Homestuck fandom is actually one of the most intellectually and socially sound fandoms I've participated in overall. And I've been in many fandoms. You could fill textbooks with the amount of analysis that exists online for this work of fiction and its fanon. The fan base has had its share of drama and faux pas, don't get me wrong, but it's also not always the toxic clusterfuck that people assume it is. They typically presume this based on a few key early events or popular people in the fandom that had an impact on how the general public and even other fandoms view Homestuck as a property. But I digress. All of this is why I think talking about Homestuck as just a mere webcomic completely misses the point of Homestuck itself. It is a meta-narrative that is interactive with its audience in a way that parallels today's popular ARGs. Arguably, Homestuck most likely helped open the cultural door to the popularity of alternate reality games and other forms of meta-narrative that followed it. More than a simple webcomic, Homestuck is a magnum opus combining elements of the webcomic itself, flash animation, games, an incredible musical soundtrack that rivals the likes of The Legend of Zelda and other household titles, and so much more. All tying together to flesh out the world building of this chronically online spin on the idea of a creation myth. What made it work wasn't just the story itself, it was the way the story interacted with the internet over multiple platforms, the way the characters interacted with each other, and the way the emotional moments felt like they happened incidentally instead of being carefully planned. Yet, in retrospect, upon revisiting the material, You see that it was all planned after all. The foreshadowing and implications in early dialogue are masterful in their direction of the audience's perspective, based on what the narrative wants you to be aware of at that time. Something that seems like an innocuous joke can become a major plot device later, and vice versa. Nothing is sacred in a meta-narrative where canon is unstable and retcons are a tangible mechanic that the characters can use to rewrite their own timelines. Homestuck also isn't at all afraid to withhold exposition, making you figure things out through hints and nudges that don't spoon-feed you everything you need to understand what is happening. You have to pay attention and put some of it together yourself, or you'll be lost. If we're being honest, Homestuck is secretly a crash course in critical thinking skills, media literacy, and narrative comprehension. And once you look at it that way, the story starts to feel a lot more intentional and precise than people usually give it credit for. Yes, it does occasionally input up massive dialogue walls, laden heavily with exposition and world building, but it also knows how to make these rambling, complicated conversations meaningful, while saving some more discrete details for later plot development. It doesn't break immersion or make you feel too much like the character is speaking directly to you, the reader. They aren't explaining to you, but to their co-players. It makes sense that they communicate things this way when you have different species from different planets and cultures working together to win a reality-breaking game where even the slightest mistake means death or worse. They have to explain some things to one another in depth, and because the story is carried by dialogue more than anything, we are along for the ride as this information is given. The dialogue-based exposition also makes sense diegetically because of its format as comics and chat logs occasionally interrupted by animated or interactive pages. This story is primarily dialogue-driven, not just action-driven. Characters do take action, but many are extremely passive and merely exist within the narrative without any grand purpose or massive plot impact. Some of the most beloved, compelling, and meaningful characters are among the most passive in the overall structure of the Spurb plotline, such as Dave and Karkat, iconic fandom darlings. Despite Dave being a keystone god-tier player and Karkat being a social leader for the group, they are surprisingly passive throughout a large part of their narrative, and much of their action and influence is influenced by others around them. They often lay low, yet are pushed or spurred on by others to take action in more significant ways. The emotional core. Characterization. If you've ever tried to reread Homestuck, you already know the pacing is completely unhinged. You'll get long stretches where absolutely nothing happens except people talking about nonsense, until out of left field something huge occurs. Then immediately after, it hits you with a sucker punch of emotional pain, only for the story to go back to joking like nothing happened. If you look at it purely from an overall plot perspective, it seems confusing, but if you look at it emotionally, it actually makes perfect sense. The pacing isn't built around dramatic tension the way a traditional story is. It's built around characterization. The story gives you time to sit with the characters long enough that you start recognizing how they talk, how they avoid certain topics, how they joke when they're uncomfortable, how they pretend not to care about things that they very obviously care about. So when something intense or emotional does happen, it doesn't feel like a dramatic twist. It feels like something that just slipped through the comedic filter by accident. The pacing feels chaotic, structurally, but emotionally it's incredibly consistent. Homestuck spends so much time convincing you it's not serious, that when it suddenly is unavoidably serious, it feels way more impactful than it has any right to. Because most stories prepare or warn you for painful emotional moments more clearly just before it unfolds. The tone shifts are less blurred. It tells you something is coming right before the big reveal. Homestuck doesn't really do that. It foreshadows, but it foreshadows long in advance, such that you may not have even noticed the foreshadowing until you revisit it later. It doesn't give you cues telling you how to feel, preparing you for every twist and turn. No. It just blasts you with an emotional gut punch and tells you to cope. It leaves you there to feel whatever you feel and form your own opinion of what has occurred. Instead of telling you what you should feel, it asks you to look inside yourself and determine how the story makes you feel on intuition. It encourages introspection and emotional awareness. With so many unreliable narrators and unstable narrative devices, one must interpret and analyze. It casually injects tear-jerking, anxiety-inducing moments directly into the middle of chaos and nonsense. Characters don't stop joking when something serious happens. They just keep on cracking wise through the pain and struggle because they don't know how to stop. This makes the emotional moments feel more realistic and relatable because in real life, people don't suddenly become fully self-aware, emotionally articulate, and perfectly tempered when something urgent or messed up happens. They get awkward. They lash out. They pick the wrong words sometimes and hurt the people close to them. They joke and deflect too much. They avoid saying the important things directly. The humor isn't there just to make the story entertaining, it's emotional armor. The characters use it to shield and mask themselves, meanwhile the story uses it to stabilize and balance the emotional tension until it's time to face the trunk beast in the room. Without Hussey's strong use of comedy, Homestuck would be a deeply depressing story of cyclical tragedy and cosmic horror. Despite this, the bright humor and clever gags keep the story out of the pits of despair, alleviating and relieving the non-stop stress that the narrative presents. Despite the slow pacing and relaxed nature of the narrative structure, Homestuck keeps you on the edge of your seat, looking for explanations and closure. A Tale of Two Nights. If you want to fundamentally understand why Homestuck works emotionally, the easiest way to do that is to look at Dave as a character. To some, this may be an odd choice as my main subject. However, as much as John is the true protagonist of Homestuck, Dave's character arc strikes so much harder. He left a heavy imprint on me as someone who was also abused and exploited by a trusted family figure in my youth. John is the protagonist, but Dave has the harshest and most brutal upbringing of all of the kids, aside from perhaps Jade. She is her own can of worms. If you look into the subtext of her grandpa's unusual fixations, however, Dave's abuse and neglect is the most overt and undeniable, so I tend to focus on his part in the story of Homestuck as a whole. Because Dave isn't just the ironic guy or the cool kid. He's not even actually cool, going based off of the standards that he was raised to believe in anyway. He's gentle-natured, conflict-avoidant, passive, and unavoidably queer, despite his neglect of this fact for the better half of the narrative. Dave was raised to aspire to the ideal of toxic masculinity, raised in a society and environment that was homophobic, hypersexual, and misogynistic. Yet, despite this, he spends most of the story being willingly subordinate to the girls around him. He respects them, and despite cracking a few questionable jokes, the vast majority of these comments are projected from within himself, not disparaging to those he cares about. And of course, he happens to be a raging bisexual/pansexual who is initially in deep denial. His first love interests and crushes in early acts were Jade and John, reflections of one another, an embodiment of the duality of his queer nature, later paralleled by Terezi and Karkat. Dave is seemingly attracted to emotional connection and chemistry, regardless of superficial things like gender, or alternatively, one could interpret him as gay with a level of compulsory heteronormativity. Nonetheless, he feels like a character who built his entire personality around avoiding emotional vulnerability. Everything he says has at least one layer of irony. Every serious conversation immediately turns into a joke, and every emotional moment gets deflected before it can really become sincere. And the reason that works so well is because it doesn't feel exaggerated. It feels shockingly realistic, despite being so extreme an example of performative patriarchal masculinity and the effect it can have on a young man. I went to school with a few Daves back in the day, and I'm sure you all knew a few as well. Dave feels like the type of person who learned very early on that being emotionally honest was not the right choice in his living situation, so instead he learned how to be funny, mostly stoic, detached, and sarcastic instead, and the story never treats that as just a joke. It treats it like a real defense mechanism that slowly starts to break down over time as he is no longer in the same headspace he was in while living in Bro's apartment. And that's what makes his emotional moments work so well. Not because they're dramatic or significant to the plot overall, but because they feel like something he's been avoiding for a very long time. He never wanted to be seen as a victim, but he is an abuse survivor. His background with Bro was not only a period of physical and emotional abuse as well as general neglect, but also bizarre sexual exploitation in the form of being filmed in puppet fetish content, which is often missed or glossed over by many readers. Dave's complicated relationship with sexuality and denial of his attraction to men makes even more sense with this added context. He was raised by a quite literally heartless man who seemed to resent his existence and made his life a chaotic, unstable hell. Adding insult to injury, he exploited Dave to make his disturbing online content and allowed him no privacy nor peace. Don't even get me started on the implied severe neglect with the utter lack of resources in their home, as well as dangerous objects and traps laid around. Seeds are planted in the dialogue early, and eventually these seeds bloom through ongoing events and show the reality of his character behind the mask. These moments of emotional vulnerability are a poignant and necessary part of his character development, regardless of relevance to the overall Spurbian plotline. If you want another related example of why Homestuck works so damn well emotionally, the closest place to look is the dynamic between Dave and Carcat, who are certainly among the most iconic poster children for the fandom aside from John Egbert himself. Because on the surface, their conversations are comically ridiculous. Most of the time, they're just insulting or rage-baiting each other. Half of the dialogue is non-stop ranting and yelling. The other half is rambling, loquacious sarcasm layered on top of stoicism. At first, it would seem like they barely communicate anything meaningful at all, yet they later have bombastic chemistry and a dynamic that eventually becomes one of the most compelling relationships in the entire narrative. But the interesting thing is that the emotional development between them happens within those absurd conversations instead of outside of them. Dave doesn't suddenly become emotionally open. Carcat doesn't suddenly stop being aggressive. Instead, the tone of their conversations changes slowly over time in a way that feels almost unnoticeable until you look back at it. Early on, their conversations feel defensive. They talk at each other instead of to each other. Every interaction feels like they're trying to prove something and fill the silence with endless chatter instead of trying to understand the other. Then, as the story goes on, the ever-present layer of irony starts to feel less like a barrier and more like a means of communicating indirectly. They still joke constantly, they still insult each other, they still avoid being sincere, but the meaning behind what they're saying starts to change. That's what makes it feel realistic. Real emotional development doesn't happen in one dramatic conversation where everything is suddenly clear. It happens in small shifts, slight changes in tone and familiarity, conversations that feel almost identical on the surface but feel completely different emotionally. Dave slowly becomes less defensive. Carcat slowly becomes less aggressive. Neither of them becomes a completely different person, but they start trusting each other in a way that feels gradual instead of dramatic. The really interesting part is that the story doesn't initially treat that development like a huge emotional event, and if it does, it's with a layer of fan service and irony. It lets it happen quietly in the background, while the characters are still joking, still raving, still pretending on the surface not to care that much. Which is honestly a much more realistic version of emotional growth than most stories ever try to show. The reason that dynamic works so well isn't just because those two characters are individually written well. It's because their relationship represents something the entire story is trying to convey. Before they can be lovers, they must be friends. Before they can be together, they must let go of baggage and the fallacious norms of their cultures. Before they can develop their bond, they must learn to trust and communicate effectively despite vast differences. They must find the likenesses and parallels and finally reach an understanding. Rivals, friends, lovers. They develop a relationship that seems to transcend the quadrants. Something foreshadowed heavily in Carcat's dialogue and in the story of the Sufferer/Signless. Both Dave and Carcat are queer by their own cultural norms, Dave being some flavor of not straight, and Carcat being pan-quadromantic. Homestuck isn't about characters suddenly becoming emotionally mature. Behind the space opera parody dressage, Homestuck is about characters slowly learning how to maintain all of their relationships and friendships without even realizing they're doing it. The emotional development doesn't happen through dramatic speeches. It happens through awkward conversations that slowly become more comfortable, through sarcasm that slowly becomes less defensive and more fond, through alienation that becomes familiarity. The story itself develops using characters who don't know how to say what they feel outright, but who still manage to show how they're feeling moment to moment within subtext. Spontaneous and absurdly expressive dialogue carries every bit of the narrative tension through implications and double meanings. Once you notice that pattern in Dave and Karkat's interactions, you start noticing it everywhere else in the story too, which makes Homestuck feel a lot more well-planned than it looks at first glance. Dialogue stylization. A lot of characters say they're about teenagers, but the characters talk like adults who went to therapy and understand their emotions perfectly. Homestuck does the exact opposite of that. Nobody knows how to communicate properly. Important conversations are extremely awkward and sometimes downright embarrassing. Emotional development happens slowly instead of in dramatic turning points. Characters care about each other deeply, but constantly pretend they don't because being emotionally honest feels uncomfortable. And that's exactly why the characters feel real. They don't feel like fictional characters designed to create sensationalist plot lines with dramatized declarations of their emotional state. They feel like people who accidentally find themselves in emotionally intense moments just by being bad at communicating. They say the wrong things. They avoid important conversations. They joke when they're uncomfortable. They care deeply but don't know how to show it in a healthy way. Instead of feeling relatable because the story tries to make them feel relatable, they feel relatable because they don't try at all. One of the most interesting things about Homestuck isn't just the story itself, it's how intensely attached people became to the characters, and I think that happened for two reasons. First, the story spent an enormous amount of time on conversations instead of action. So instead of remembering the characters for what they did, people remember them for how they interacted with each other, how they talked, how they joked. It feels more personal because it feels more conversational. And second, the emotional tone of the story feels very similar to how a lot of people interacted online at the time. So instead of feeling like fictional characters, the characters feel like people you might have actually talked to online. The fandom didn't just get attached to the story, it got attached to the tone of the dialogue. Even though the fandom talks a lot about romance, the actual emotional core of Homestuck was always friendship. Even good lovers must first be good friends. This is a strong undercurrent in the thematic trappings of Homestuck. The biggest emotional moments aren't romantic confessions. They're moments where characters finally understand each other a little better, or moments where people who didn't trust each other before slowly start trusting each other over time. The story isn't really about falling in love. It's about learning how to talk to people, learning how to trust people, learning how to grow up emotionally while you're still trying to figure out who you even are, learning to connect with others while saddled with trauma and survivor's guilt. And that's probably why the emotional moments still work now, because friendships changing over time feels more real than perfect romantic arcs ever could. Homestuck didn't just feel like something you read, it felt like something you experienced alongside everyone else who was there at the time. It's a webcomic, but it's more than that, more than a meme or a fandom. Homestuck is a bold, absurdist, meta-narrative masterpiece, and somehow that makes it even more meaningful now than it was back then. With the incoming Homestuck renaissance that I anticipate will occur upon any release of some form of Homestuck animated series, I find myself reflecting on the cultural impact of Homestuck, and I'm excited to experience this incredible fandom brought back to life all over again. To the old fans like me, and the new fans just now entering their Homestuck era, thanks for playing. Brief afterthought. For those of you who have been waiting so long for me to come back, I truly have no words for the amount of gratitude that I feel for every comment that I've received in my absence, asking where I am and letting me know that you would love to see me make more content. That without that encouragement, I would not have been motivated to regain access to this channel and to continue to find a way to create this content. So genuinely, from the bottom of my heart, thank you all very much. I appreciate the fuck out of you.